Welcome to this U.S. History Explainer. Today, we're going to unpack the absolute pressure cooker of cause and effect that sparked the American Revolution. We are diving right into exactly how a series of strict imperial policies basically ignited a massive firestorm of protests, some highly strategic propaganda, and ultimately an all-out war for independence.
Okay, so here's our roadmap for the day. We'll be moving through imperial wealth and control, protests and propaganda, declaring independence, the contested ideals, and then we'll wrap the whole thing up with a quick recap and reflection.
To really understand the revolution, we've got to start with Section 1, Imperial Wealth and Control.
So why did Great Britain want such an incredibly tight grip on North America in the first place? Well, it all comes down to an economic theory called mercantilism. Under mercantilism, the colonies existed for one main reason: to generate wealth for the British Empire, not for themselves. Honestly, think of it kind of like a strict parent making you hand over your entire paycheck just because you live under their roof. Britain wanted to make sure all that colonial trade funneled resources directly back to the mother country.
Let's trace how this actually played out. Back in 1607, English migrants set up Jamestown with a very clear commercial mindset. They realized pretty quickly that growing tobacco was a massive cash crop. Fast forward a bit to 1660, King Charles II gets restored to power. He wastes absolutely no time trying to flex England's global muscles, and he does this by passing the Navigation Acts in the 1660s. These acts strictly regulated colonial trade to keep the wealth locked inside the empire. But as you can probably guess, colonial merchants were definitely not thrilled about having their hands tied like this.
And that frustration leads us right into Section 2, protests and propaganda. The colonial temperature is really starting to rise here.
So Britain is racking up national debt, and they decide to squeeze the colonies for more revenue. Enter the Townshend Acts of 1767, which placed a tax on everyday consumer goods like tea and glass. This totally shifted the colonial frustration from just economic annoyance into active political resistance. The colonists felt this was a direct assault on their liberty. You had people like John Dickinson arguing that, sure, the empire could regulate trade, but Parliament had absolutely no right to slap external taxes on imports just to make a quick buck, especially when the colonists had no representatives in Parliament. That whole idea of taxation without representation really became the ultimate rallying cry.
But you know, this grassroots resistance wasn't just coming from a bunch of wealthy politicians writing essays. There was actually this brilliant verse published in a Boston newspaper in 1767 urging women to boycott British tea and linen. This non-importation movement turned everyday women into vital political actors. By choosing to manufacture their own homespun cloth, they took a domestic chore and turned it into a powerful weapon against the British economy. And let's be real, spinning your own itchy, rough cloth by hand took hours of grueling work. This was a massive, physically uncomfortable commitment to the cause.
Let's pause for a quick check here. Based on what we've just covered about the boycotts, why did the clothes you wore suddenly matter so much to the revolutionary movement? Take a second and think about it.
If you figured it was a defiant political gesture, you hit the nail on the head. It literally allowed everyday consumers to strike back. By choosing some rough, homespun cloth over fancy British attire, they were starving the British economy and protesting taxation without representation in a very visible way.
But economic boycotts were just one piece of the puzzle. Media was a total game changer. Think about the crazy difference between the messy reality of the Boston Massacre and how it was actually portrayed in print. Eyewitness accounts described a crowd of rough laborers basically starting a brawl by hurling snowballs and rocks at British soldiers. But then you look at Paul Revere's famous engraving, and it depicts this incredibly innocent, well-dressed crowd just standing there helplessly while ruthless soldiers fire into them point blank.
Time for another pause check. Why in the world would an engraver like Paul Revere intentionally alter the facts of such a deadly event in his artwork? What was his endgame?
The immediate reason for this historical Photoshop: pure, relentless propaganda. Revere wanted to enrage the public. By totally highlighting the cruelty of the soldiers and playing up the innocence of the civilians, he effectively used media to manipulate opinion and unite the colonies in outrage against British oppression.
With colonial anger practically boiling over and British troops occupying their cities, an ideological break was inevitable. Let's look at Section 3, Declaring Independence.
So in 1776, they adopt the Declaration of Independence, formally dissolving those political ties to Great Britain. It famously lays out that all men are created equal, endowed with unalienable rights like life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Crucially, it argued that a government only gets its power from the consent of the governed,
And if a government becomes destructive, which they absolutely believe the British Crown had, well, the people have every right to alter or abolish it.
But hey, beyond all those soaring high ideals, the Declaration also unleashed some incredibly explicit, severe grievances. They accused the king of plundering their seas, burning their towns, and bringing in armies of foreign mercenaries to, quote, complete the works of death. It really highlights the brutal, physical reality of the war they were fighting. They were literally pledging their lives to take on a massive global empire.
Now we need to look at the whole picture, which brings us to Section 4, the contested ideals.
There is a very glaring paradox at the heart of this newly forming society. On one hand, you've got this beautiful revolutionary ideal that all men are created equal and entitled to liberty. But on the other hand, the stark colonial reality in places like Virginia was the systemic, brutal rise of chattel slavery to support that lucrative tobacco economy. On top of that, the expansion of English settlements led to devastating warfare and the violent displacement of native peoples like the Powhatan Confederacy. So, while the founders championed freedom from tyranny, those high ideals tragically fell short for enslaved Africans and indigenous populations during that exact same period.
We've covered a ton of ground today. Let's pull it all together in Section 5, recap and reflection.
Let's quickly trace the domino effect we just walked through. We started with imperial control, mercantilism, and acts regulating trade led straight to intense economic frustration. That naturally sparked resistance, where grassroots boycotts and incredibly strategic propaganda united public opinion. This tension exploded into full-on independence with the 1776 Declaration, cementing an ideological break and kicking off a physical war. Finally, we looked at the contested reach of all this, noting that while the ideals were groundbreaking, the harsh realities of slavery and native displacement meant true equality was still a long way off.
Before we go, I want to leave you with this final thought. Considering how insanely effective Paul Revere was at using a single engraving to manipulate colonial public opinion over 250 years ago, how might the modern media and digital campaigns that you scroll through every single day be carefully designed to shape your understanding of current global conflicts? It's a pretty wild reminder that the tools of persuasion are always evolving, but the core goal is exactly the same. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and always keep questioning what you see.